So in our last video, we talked about how the Treaty of Versailles and a lot of other things, including the stock market crash of 1929, are going to lead to an economic depression, not only in Europe, not only in the United States, but around the world. I mentioned as we got towards the end of those, and just by name referenced them, that these terrible economic conditions are going to be the reason for the rise of people that you see on your screen right now, the reason of these totalitarian regimes. When you see that word totalitarian, I hope that you can just look at the first, five letters of that and see total. A totalitarian leader is it's a dictatorship. It's one leader that has total control of a country. They control everything from the media to the laws, that they control every aspect of people's lives in a country. And we're going to look into a few of them now. So, during the 1930s, economics problems and unstable governments resulted in the takeover of a new type of ruler in the USSR with Joseph Stalin. Remember, he's the one that's going to take over after Vladimir Lenin dies. Italy is going to be led by Benito Mussolini. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler is going to take over in the 1930s. And all of these people have in common, they are all totalitarian leaders. Mussolini and Hitler are very close. They're both fascists that believe in this strong government control. They're not quite communist, though. While Stalin is a communist, Mussolini and Hitler are not. So I just wanted to put that out there. Totalitarians were like absolute monarchs in that they had all of the power, but they also used several new strategies to keep themselves in power: propaganda and fear. And we talked about World War I propaganda to motivate the home front and motivate soldiers. Fear, not so much. Well, I mean, fear by portraying the enemy as villains. But totalitarian leaders are going to use propaganda to convince the country, the world, their people that they are doing what's best for them, and also fear to keep them in line in case, the propaganda and love part doesn't work. Very Machiavellian-like, do whatever is necessary to stay in power. They use speeches, propaganda songs, posters, and images to showcase their power and also put themselves and show themselves as these positive figures. They also use censorship a lot, which we talked about with some of the absolute monarchs. They censored any media that was negative or could raise questions about any of their actions or policies. They had elite militia units loyal to them and their power that would do anything they say. And if you're acting under the totalitarian leader, there's no laws that apply to you. So very violent. There's nothing that's off the table. They were used to keep people in line, make people fearful, and just honestly commit all types of terror and violence against their own citizens that they thought were against their totalitarian leader. Mussolini had the black shirts, and Hitler had the SS, or also the Gestapo, their secret police force. They used secret police, trials, and prison camps to oppress, imprison, and kill political enemies. Hitler is obviously going to open up concentration camps that's going to kill over 12 million people, at least 6 million Jews, also filled with political figures and all other people that Hitler didn't see as true Germans, or at least true Germans that were loyal to him. Stalin is actually probably responsible for millions of more deaths than Hitler was, but Hitler is going to, during World War II, and we'll get into it a little bit later when we talk about the Holocaust, is going to do it across Europe. He's going to have concentration camps in many different countries in Europe. Stalin, on the other hand, was able to, I want to say, do it a bit more privately, because most of the people that were sent to these gulags, which are these terrible, basically work you to death camps, were Russian citizens and were in, way out in Siberia where no one could get to, and people really didn't know the full scope of them. The important thing to keep in mind is that all of these leaders that we're talking about, no matter how violent and how ruthless they were as leaders, all came to power legitimately, received some type of vote, either democratically from the people or the system of government they were elected in. And then after they had control, as leader, eliminated anybody that was against them in order to get all of control. So just because someone does something legally, keep in mind, these are the consequences that can happen. Stalin was put into power by a group of communist government officials after Lenin's death in 1924. He wasn't a great public speaker. But as we said, very Machiavellian in that he used manipulation, violence, and corruptions to take and keep power. He wasted no time in eliminating the kulak system, which was the system that allowed, we talked about Lenin's NEP or his new economic policy that allowed private farmers and small businesses to profit from their own gain. Stalin is much more of a strict government control over everything. So he's going to get rid of Lenin's new economic policy and take the country back to complete government control, complete communism. In doing so, he eliminated any chain, basically got rid of all capitalist kind of components that existed. And by taking away their ability to make money, would also make the people that were capitalists less powerful. He also moved quickly to establish the Gulag system for political opponents, which I mentioned earlier, which were work camps designed to work people to death and isolated in cold Siberia. If you went to the Gulag, you did not come back. There's a lot of different documentaries and things you can hear from people who actually did survive the Gulag and about the terrible experience, unimaginable that these people went through. Joseph Stalin is also known for his great purges, and purges are basically, I mean, we've all seen the movie The Purge, but it's basically getting rid of anybody, purging, getting rid of any of the people that stand against you or that you might even think stand against you. Uh, Thousands, millions of innocent people that may have been against Stalin or not against Stalin are going to lose their lives. Certain military advisors were told, "Give me the name of 1,000 traitors uh, by this time, and if you don't give me 1,000, then your name's going to be added to the list." So even his military advisors, sometimes it was killed or be killed. By the 1930s, Stalin had something called 5-year plans that were going to very successfully industrialize the USSR, or Soviet Union. His 5-year plans, the really only thing that you need to know, you don't need to go super into the details of it, but you need to know that 5-year plans were all about industrializing the USSR's economy. Um, Basically trying to catch it up to the powerhouses of other countries in Europe. So Stalin's 5-year plans were all about increased economic output of heavy industries, coal, iron, making steel, and all of these other things. Purges, getting rid of people, his 5-year plans to industrialize the heavy industries of the USSR. However, his collectivization scheme failed to produce enough grain or enough food for people. So his major two things that he's responsible for are, we'll call it three: purges, getting rid of millions of people that he believed stood against him or questioned his authority; his 5-year plans, which were all about industrializing Russia as quick as possible; and third, you see that collectivization. Think about the word collect. He basically went around to all of the small individually owned farms, collected them together, and turned them into large government owned farms that the peasants were forced to work on. So it created collectivization, or just these large government owned farms peasants are forced to work on. The grain goes to the state and is distributed however the states want it distributed. Opposition arose to this scheme, especially in Ukraine, because he is going to brutally punish the Ukrainians that live there by exporting already low grain amounts and starving millions of Ukrainians. This is going to be a human rights violation. It's going to end up in the millions of deaths of Ukrainians, sometimes called the Ukrainian Holodomor. Millions of Ukrainians are going to die because Stalin is going to intentionally starve them to death by taking away all of the food that they have. He also took this opportunity in the 1930s to put anyone on trial who opposed his ideas. Earlier in the 1920s, basically anyone that ever stood up to him in the past, military officials, political members, he had executed. Sure, sometimes they were given a trial, usually with fake evidence against them, worked them to death in the Gulag system. There is no trial by jury. Stalin's secret police are the judge, jury, and executioner in many cases. Despite these brutal tactics and deaths of millions, Stalin's propaganda campaign portrayed him in posters and on the radio as some hero who is leading Russia into the future by industrializing the Soviet Union. And he did industrialize the Soviet Union, but the question is, at what cost? That cost is the millions of deaths of people of his own country, the hard work of peasants forced that weren't even put to death around his entire country. So while he was successful with his 5-year plans, uh, his leadership overall should be considered, brutal with the deaths of millions of people. And he also had the failure of collectivization that never produced enough food to really feed his entire country. To show you this picture of Joseph Stalin without any of the context that I just gave you, you'd probably think, wow, what a wonderful person he is. There's even propaganda pictures that he posted in, that he posed in. There was a picture taken of him with a young girl in a parade, smiling next to each other. A wonderful, nice photo. Um, it's terrible because later on he had that girl's father taken to a gulag in Siberia and eventually murdered while still using his face next to his daughter to show how wonderful he was. So you can see the use of propaganda coming into play. So let's talk a little bit about Mussolini and Hitler, who, remember, are not communists. They are fascist. Mussolini and Hitler are not communists. So in Italy and Germany, Hitler and Mussolini would be known as fascist dictators who used a combination of fear, propaganda, and public image to maintain power and popularity, the same way Stalin did in the USSR. Fascism attempted to control all aspects of the government and society while opposing democracy and Marxism. Fascists were good, charismatic speakers who gained support of the people by their public speaking, their nationalism, and talking about, returning countries to how great they were before they were, crushed by the Treaty of Versailles in World War I. Lastly, both promoted and glorified remilitarization and the return of their countries as powerful world leaders who sought to expand national borders through conflict. So really bringing out that nationalism in people. They're also, as we said earlier, going to use secret police forces to get rid of political opponents and maintain order by fear. So remember, Mussolini, Hitler, and Joseph Stalin are all totalitarian. Out of those, Stalin is the only one that is a communist. So Hitler was a very good public speaker and is going to rise to the top before legally changing the government and purging it of anybody who disagreed with him. What made Hitler so popular was that basically he blamed losing World War I on the Jews in his country. He blamed the other Western European countries for the Treaty of Versailles that killed Germany's economy, and basically talked about his hate of foreigners and foreign ideas, and that Democrats, communists, and Jews were the reason Germany lost in World War I. When coming to power in 1933, he's going to become very popular because his public work projects that we mentioned earlier are going to work. He's going to get people back to work. People are going to have jobs, so they're going to spend money, and the economy is going to improve. So people were willing to support Hitler because of everything that he did for the economy and their jobs. He continued to gain popularity by persecuting Jews with his policies. We've talked about anti-Semitism in class, including his 1935 Nuremberg laws, which made a lot of restrictions on Jewish people, including making it illegal for someone that was Jewish to marry someone that wasn't. All of those marriages were seen as void. And here we see a picture of Adolf Hitler, very clearly a propaganda picture of him trying to lead Germany. And, you see him in a very positive light here. And that's how he tried to portray himself in propaganda. So that's the rise of these different leaders that are going to be that totalitarian leaders with total control. Our next one is going to be on World War II and talk a little bit about more of their actions as they become leaders, but understanding that the terrible economic conditions is what allowed people to be desperate enough to go to leaders like this and either promote or overlook the negative side of them because it was good for the economy. And you have to ask yourself, were all of these people really that blind to put the economy over actual people's lives and freedoms? All right, so that's all on the rise of these totalitarian leaderships, and our next one will be on World War II.